Hey, I'm DMS. You're watching the Headphone Show. Today I have Justin from Amps and Sound. He's the owner, the creator. A lot of amplifiers you've probably seen around at shows. Justin, thank you for joining me today. I wanted to talk about the Leadaloo, an amplifier I've had in here for a little while, and one that Headphones.com has partnered with you on. It's been a really interesting amp as I've been testing it out, and I kind of wanted to know more of the ins and outs of, well, I guess where this thing came from. But before we get into that, I am sure that a lot of people watching, myself included, would love to know more of kind of the background of Amps and Sound, like where this whole thing came from, where it started, because from my knowledge, I've seen you make a lot of things in the high end, and it popped up on my radar a few years ago, just out of nowhere.
Sure. So I've been building horn-loaded speakers and amplifiers for 15 to 17 years now. And, you know, we started out building things from scratch, building things from kits, and generally just making one change at a time, understanding what we wanted to get from things. Things that have always been really important to us is, I don't want to just say craftsmanship, but build quality. So, you know, we take a great deal of pride in how they're made. They're made with purpose. We very rarely try to make a Swiss Army knife. We would rather someone have a device that does a few things really, really well than one that does everything with a compromise. That's just not our way of doing things. So
right,
an example is like I own an awful lot of cabling, and each cable is sort of a very specific length. So if I make a change to my system, I cable it so that I have sort of the shortest, you know, most practical cables for that length of system. And when the system changes, so do the cables. Because I don't believe in extras. I try to keep as little fat on the bone, as they say, as possible. So, you know, we started out building ideas of modest powered tube amps and horn-loaded speakers because that's what interested me and where I felt like I could get the most sonic dividends, and was pretty successful for that for a lot of years. And the personal audio market really accelerated very, very quickly, and the same sort of design principles that go into making a very quiet yet dynamic amp that can handle horn-loaded speakers are the same sort of ideas that happen with high efficiency headphones. You know, people want dynamics and power, but they want quietness as well. There are ways to get better answers to things, ways to make tube amps better behaved. I think they sound less good doing so, but also they become less repairable long term. So an example might be like a voltage regulator. Voltage regulators can do an awful lot of good things in a tube amp. The problem with them is that they actually go obsolete pretty quickly, within 10 years. A tube amp might have a 40-year lifespan to it if it's maintained correctly. And so this dollar part may be the undoing of a product that should have lasted 40 years.
That's an interesting way to look at it. Yeah, I know on this amp, rectification, everything you're all doing with tubes. Actually, I noticed the pre-tube on it is the same one that I have tattooed on my arm right there.
Super cool.
It escapes me if it was a 12 AU, AT, or AX7, but I recall that all three are essentially the same thing with different gain stages.
Yep.
But I remember immediately upon seeing that, I was like, I know that tube. I've used a bunch of those before. Commonly, actually, those are used in microphones as well. I do appreciate the amp being an all-tube design. There are a lot of hybrids on the market, and sure, they do sound good, but it is nice having something that is just a thoroughbred all the way through tube amp, kind of has more of that kind of sound that I feel like people buying a tube amp are after. And I also noticed on this one, like a few other tube amps that you've made, it does have a output for low and high impedance, which I guess one of the kind of things that people run into is with a good bit of tube amps on the market, you are stuck with either something that is a hybrid that outputs to planars or a high impedance only output, and then when you plug up something like a planar, all the power fizzles out. So it's nice kind of having that option, but this is, you know, like you mentioned, this one in particular is a bit of a Swiss Army knife in the sense that it does speakers as well, which is really a whole lot for one amplifier to be doing. So I imagine that probably was a bit of a task to kind of design all that into an amplifier, given that, you know, your overall design philosophy is to kind of, you know, do everything as best you possibly can.
So the speaker taps are actually perhaps the easiest thing to include, and the one thing that is sort of a universal inclusion.
I wouldn't have
I got
expected
told
that.
maybe like 10 years ago. Jason Lord is a really good friend of mine and gave me some advice. He goes, you'd sell more amps if you took away the speaker tabs. And from a market research standpoint, I think he's right about that, in that if you have a product that just does one thing, it's easier for people to consume and understand. I always wanted amplifiers that did speakers or headphones because that's what I used in my life. And there were days and moments where I did more of one versus the other. I never did them at the same time, and this amp doesn't do it at the same time, and I think very few people will ever need to do them at the exact same time. But later in the day or later in the evening or next year, your life will be different, and what you ask of your amplifier may be different. And having an amplifier that can summon the ability to do both is really an interesting idea, because when you find a good sound, whether that's like your favorite set of headphones, the cable that you've chosen, the DAC that you've chosen, or the tubes that you've chosen, you have invested time in understanding what was in front of you and how to make decisions that cultivate that sound. And just because your life circumstances change doesn't mean that you want your sound to change. And so, I have always had what was called like a Mogwai, and then I made a Lilu to sort of match that same question. I always had an amp that had headphones and speakers in my office, and so this amp was sort of answering that question of it. Wasn't too big, wasn't too small, and it could either do headphones or speakers interchangeably, because that's what I needed for an office system. Earlier in my life, I had a younger child, and I needed headphones for sure. And then, as that graduated, it became my office system with a pair of bookshelves. And I've always found that to be, that kind of duality of a system is really important, because otherwise you lock somebody into a role assignment that doesn't honor that their life is ever changing. But how we get there is actually both an elegant and a super complicated answer at the same time. The simple version is our transformers do all the work, where amps that have multiple taps from other manufacturers typically will do one tap that can be a compromise, let's say like an 8-ohm tap for speakers. And then they use resistors to create a voltage divider network to modulate the impedance to make it more compatible for headphones. And depending on the complexity of the voltage divider network, depends on how many taps you might have, or at what impedance they're controlling the headphone or introducing the headphone. We sort of come at audio from a home-cooked Italian food perspective, in that as few ingredients as possible, but they all really need to darn matter. And so, like, our capacitor choices matter, our wiring matters a great deal to us. That's the execution question. But our transformers really, 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 really matter to us. And so our transformers, which is the complicated answer, is they're custom wound for us with various secondary impedances. So they allow us to actually directly strap the transformer. There are resistors that are on the jack of the amp. The moment you put a 1/4-inch jack into the amp, the resistors are physically taken out of circuit. So there's nothing between you and that transformer.
Okay.
Which is to say that you're sort of bootstrapping, tube transformer output, nothing in between, is a novel answer. Not as many manufacturers have really come to that answer, mostly because to do so requires a lot of investment in transformers.
I can only imagine how heavy of a box that has to be. You get in a shipment of those things. That's an interesting way to do that. I guess I've never heard of a system like that where you have resistance on it that then is, I guess, decoupled once the headphone is placed on it. But I guess that makes sense because it kind of keeps a load on it and keeps it stable.
So it keeps a load on the output. Although, I mean, like, these output transformers that are on the Lilu are 5-watt output transformers. If you spec them from other manufacturers, they might call them 7-watt output transformers. So a 5-watt output transformer for a 3-watt amp is a lot of physical overhead. And of course, we could just saturate the core and dump the power directly into the core, but that's ugly and not pretty. It's an inelegant answer. So by putting loading resistors on the jack, the moment you put the 1/4-inch jack into the jack, the resistors are taken out of circuit physically.
That's very cool.
So we always tell people, if you're using an extension cable, which don't use an extension cable, go buy a cable of the right length. You'll like it better.
Yeah.
But if you use an extension cable, turn the amp on or off, or pull out the extension cable. Don't decouple it from the extension cable.
Okay.
Because you're bypassing the loading resistors. The same level of attention and quality that goes into a Lilu goes into my $12,000 Red October. We don't change how we build things. The Red October asks more of us, given the complexity of it and its use of turrets, but we're still just as fanatical. And if it's not beautiful, I mean beautifully wired, it doesn't leave. We care about that in equal measure to how it sounds.
Okay.
So there are things that I'd like to build. Like I see amps that have like absolutely gorgeous casework. And one of the difficulties I have is, it's been suggested to me by like some coaches that I have, outsource your casework. There are people who can do this well for you. And there's a truth to that. But I've had some bad experiences where I have counted on partnerships or partners to try to move the ball further without me rowing that boat or pushing that rock forward, with bad outcomes. If you don't control the process, it becomes harder to control the outcomes. And so like we build relatively simple amplifiers, but they're honest.
Right.
To some degree, that's one of their selling points, is that they're a straight up device. You can open it up, follow it. The secret sauce is in the transformers and in the attention to detail in the execution.
Just out of a personal curiosity,
Sure.
It seems like then that would be something that is potentially user serviceable or easy to repair.
100%. As long as you're not a nincompoop. I mean, so one of the jokes of the company is, it's called a mogwai for a reason. Unless you get it wet while on.
Right.
What tube amp? No, there's not a tube amp that won't bite you if you get it wet while turned on.
Yeah. I mean, I don't usually use my tube amps in the shower. People.
But I mean, think about how many tube amps died a premature death in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s because somebody who had a drink in their hand, probably a libation, and was leaning over while playing with the volume control.
Yeah, or some guy who decided it was right to use his amp as a coaster.
That happens.
It does.
Happened.
Things like that still happen. You'd be surprised the things that I have seen on like forums and discords and things like that.
A voltmeter and a soldering iron will repair this device. There's nothing on here that a continuity test and a soldering iron can't fix.
And actually kind of going down this same route, the things that people do, people will probably be plugging up all kinds of stuff to this amp. So I kind of wanted to dive into speakers a little bit on it. If you're just looking at a bare spreadsheet and you're thinking, okay, 3 watts on this versus 10 watts on a solid state amp, you might think, well, 3 watts can't do anything. The thing is that I've had this here plugged up to towers. I've had this here plugged up to bookshelf speakers. And it does very easily get up to listening levels. Can you kind of enlighten me a little bit from your perspective on, like, I guess what's going on here and how I can kind of know, what I should be running off this thing?
From a functional standpoint, you should consider that this can run most moderately efficient speakers as well as headphones. Now, I don't want to say that we underreport our specs, but how we measure our specs is not in the same manner that other manufacturers might. So there's ways to use automated testing procedures that give you instantaneous measurements, and devices, whether solid state or digital, or solid state or analog, can give one reading that's an instantaneous reading and give perhaps a very different reading versus that is a sustained reading. So when we measure it, we're actually measuring wattage as can be delivered under 100% duty cycle. I think that you have to look at the rating of a speaker and as far as its efficiency, and think about what is average use in your room very, very, very few people ever really listen above 75 dB, maybe 78 dB loud. And so a speaker that is, let's say, 92 decibels loud at 1 watt is going to be more than loud on a 3 watt amplifier. As a demonstration, when people come into my own listening room, which is like heavily dampened, truth be told, because it's small, is I have them touch the drywall, and it's like, can you feel that? And if they say, yeah, I can feel that, I'm like, all right, we already screwed the hooch, as they say. We already have destroyed quality listening, because the moment your drywall is activated and resonating, you've turned it into a second speaker, and you're introduced an awful lot of distortion into the room. If you're listening loud enough that you can feel the tempo or rhythm on a pane of glass, or on a picture frame, on the glass of a picture frame, or on your drywall, you've already introduced so much sound energy into the room that you're getting a lot of distortion, not from the speaker, not from the amplifier, but from the room itself, which goes back to the first rule of good sound is that your room is your problem.
That's a really interesting perspective. I never thought about it quite like that before. I mean, I know over the years there's been a million different times I've tried to tackle a room and, looked at how different types of treatment work. But I've never quite thought about things like drywall, window panes, and other things like that.
And typically, truthfully, we can listen to things extraordinarily loud, but the moment we start hearing distortion, whether it's from the room or from the equipment, we start turning it down because we're sensing something is wrong with the sound. That doesn't mean it's something wrong necessarily from the amplification or from the speakers. It could be your room is too small and you're playing it too loud for that room to absorb that much energy.
And the vast majority of listening rooms probably have a dozen problems that need to be addressed.
I mean, I had a very close friend who spent like $4,000 in listening in room treatments. I'm not that guy. I'm not the person to do that. But he has very good ears and a very good system, and he swears it's the thing that's made the biggest improvement in his room. I just put down a lot of carpet, and I have tapestries because I like tapestries. But tapestries in front of drywall will absorb an awful lot of acoustic energy. If I can give everybody just some cheap, good advice, so if everybody knows who Owens Corning is. If you go on Amazon, you can get Owens Corning acoustic panels for like 4 panels for like $100. You can look it up. They're like 24 by 2 feet by 3 feet stacks, and there's companies that will cover them in like speaker fabric essentially. So it's you can either get denim, like compressed denim, or you can get fiberglass. And then they cover it in speaker fabric for you. And then you just build a very simple wood frame around it or Velcro it to your walls. And you've created really, really inexpensive, speaker traps or acoustic traps for your room. I believe that, butter belongs on bread. Acoustic treatment belongs on walls.
Yeah.
Copiously.
Circling back, your listening space, you're definitely, that guy has probably been through a number of speakers then. I would love to hear what speakers you think pair well with this amplifier, or your own personal recommendations, maybe what you listen to.
Sure. So I'll tell you what I run currently and why, and then I'll tell you some good suggestions.
Okay.
So I got a hair up my butt and decided that I was going to build some Altec 604s. And so Altec 604 is like 98 dB efficient. So 3 watts is all I've ever needed. I'm a low power amplifier kind of guy. So I bought a set of Altec 604s from Great Plains Audio. I didn't like their crossover, so I built my own because I have friends that are, savants when it comes to crossover development. And I put it into a cabinet that made sense for the space. So it looks sort of the size of a Klipsch Cornwall with a 16-inch big woofer and a horn.
Okay.
And it sounds amazing. And then I built a horn-loaded speaker that looks like a Heresy, but it's actually what we'd call Corn Scala. So it's a really huge horn and a 12-inch woofer with a crossover I developed. So I use mostly my own equipment at this point because it represents my own values really, really well. Things I own and love, that are not in my music space, but that I still own and love, are and that pair incredibly well with these amplifiers. So Falcon Acoustic LS35As, which are essentially BBC licensed LS35As and the most faithful reproduction of that studio monitor. They're super tiny. Many people would argue they sound the very best in my room, and I should stop building big speakers and just accept that my room is small and I should use a micro monitor like every other sensible person. I don't believe in that, but I hear the argument. But the Falcons are just absolute time capsules and are truthful monitors. They sound exactly what they're like, the source material. So they have beguiling big bass for a really, really, really tiny speaker. We're talking like 10 inches tall, 5 inches wide, 6 inches deep. I mean, like a small speaker.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't have to be used near field. I mean, even though I think it's like in the 80s, you put that on a stand and you're done. That's a solid answer that'll fill the room. KEF LS50 Metas, one of the
speaker.
very, very best mass-produced speaker.
Mm-hmm.
I would not use it in midfield, and I would not use it in a big room with this amp, but I would use it near field and have. It's a insanely good set of speakers in the near field. You put them between your monitor, you put the amp on one side of it, and you call it good. It will answer everything you needed it to. And the LS50 has an option for a sub, which is a really nice idea. If you want, if you want to be super special, you can buy 2 subs and swarm together. And at its price point, which is like $1,500, it's democratized. Everybody can purchase it.
Right.
Getting slightly more exotic and room filling would be like the Zoo Union 6s, which is, I think, a $2,500 speaker or $3,000 speaker, 10-inch woofer with a coaxial 1-inch tweeter. That thing will rock the house, and it is just such a good choice. And it's an American speaker company. They're made in Ogden, Utah. And they source from Eminence, and so the drivers are also U.S. made. And there's a lot to be said about that. There's an interesting storyline through that, and they can get you a big old sub. Their subs, bonkers yummy. I love Klipsch speakers. I've been a member of the Klipsch forum for like 20 years. I think that the perfect set of speakers for this amp, from my perspective, is a set of Heresies.
Okay.
The Klipsch Heresy is a 3-way with a 12-inch woofer. You're going to get really, really good bass out of it. You're never going to have an issue of headroom. And in California, some of our homes, the windows are rather low slung, less than 2 feet or about 2 feet tall off the ground. And so from a visual standpoint, if you have a big speaker that doesn't ever break your window line, it doesn't ever make your room seem visually smaller. So if you have a speaker that starts to break the window line, the room becomes as small as the front of the speaker itself. So if your speaker is 18 inches deep, your room just got 18 inches shallower because you see it. Whereas if it was under the window line, even if it was like 2 feet deep, you don't really notice it encroaching into your room because you still have visual access from the windows. And so the Heresy is a really easy to live with speaker.
Right.
Because it doesn't goof up our windows.
A lot like, I think the JBL, is it L100 Classic?
JBL 100 Classic's a great choice too. I mean, then we get into sort of the debate of like, is the L100 that's made today, which looks super cool, and I love the stands, sound the same as the original JBL 100. People get into that whole...
Oh, right. Circling to the other side of this is a headphone amplifier, so I'm sure you must have some headphones. I'm curious to know, A, what kind of things you like with it, but also what you use. What are your headphones?
Sure. Okay. So I have a set of 1266s.
Okay.
I would say it's right at the edge of what my 1266s will do. And my 1266s they're like stethoscopes. They're used to see into the music and see into the amplifier. The 1266s are pretty awesome in that sense.
Oh, that is a power-hungry headphone.
It is. I use a preamp in front of it. I think that any single-ended amp sounds better with a pre or a lot of voltage gain. on the front end. I'm going to do a video, I think, about like how to build a pre that's reasonable. We're going to offer a pre at some point. But if you have a good DAC that has a good output, it's not an issue. It's just a question of sometimes I have run my own system where I had like a Dragonfly and an iPad. And that's actually a pretty good front end. Like, I'm not going to knock it. Like I see the value of that as an idea. I will tell you though that, a Dragonfly into something like a little standalone pre, the iPad into the Dragonfly into standalone pre, it becomes a grown-up system. Like its level of sophistication changes. The amp's performance is not exhausted yet. And it's not fully realized, and realizing it sometimes takes having better upstream electronics.
Right.
I don't normally do that. I tend to be sort of the value, middle of the road kind of guy for my own personal choices. But when I've made the effort and put things on the front end that were better, I was always rewarded for doing so. So, I mean, I own reference headphones, so I don't own a SUS currently, but I have an LCD5, I have a 1266. I don't have the Atrium, but I have the Verite. And the LCD5 and the 1266 are super cool because when I use Roon as my front end, I have access to some filters that were made that are super cool. Because if you use Roon, you can have what's called convolution filters. I'm sure you've done talks on this.
Oh, yeah.
That is super, super amazing and shows you what the zenith of your sound quality can be. Now, what are my everyday carry? It's a ZMF icon because I love the isolation of a ZMF. Yeah. I love the isolation of a ZMF icon, and I like the wallop. I think the HD800s are every person's common choice. The best default choice for any person is an HD800 probably. So I talk about like the answer on the extreme, but the answer in the middle of the road, I tell everybody that the LCDX is like the everyday man's choice for a planner. Just like the Aria, if whether you're I think like some of the best planners are Dan Clark's, but I think like the easiest choice for people sometimes is like the Hi-Fi Man Aria or the LCDX.
Oh yeah.
So the short answer, I guess, is like I'm total ZMF fanboy, but Sennheiser HD800s and Odyssey LCDXs are, I think, my best choices for like the Lilu-esque question, and I think show the very best of what the Lilu can do. Like the LCDX can be used on the high or low Z, and you're going to get a slightly different sound signature. One will be fuller, one will be tighter.
That's a pretty solid list. I feel like those are a lot of those are household name headphones that people in the audiophile community either aspire to own or a lot of them do own. And I feel like a lot of the people that have had a collection at some point definitely either own or have owned a lot of those.
The most accessible answer would be like an HD 600 or HD 650, which will sound amazing. I would almost argue like someone, before they talk you into buying a more expensive headphone, perhaps try a better amplifier. Because the total performance of your HD 580, 600, 650 has not been fully realized.
The 650 is such an insanely good headphone, and I feel like a lot of people haven't heard it until they've heard it on tubes.
100%. And obviously I'd like you to hear it from me with a transformer coupled design, but there are other choices, and they're very good, really, really good choices as well. And the 650 will show you what the amplifier is doing, and it could be that middle point to like where you can make performance assessments, because if you can hear it on a 650, you can hear it on something more expensive with greater ease.
Well, cool. Justin, I really appreciate you joining us today. It's really cool hearing about the different headphones and speakers you've used over the years, the things you recommend with this, and learning more about the Lilu itself. This amplifier, obviously we're not reviewing it because it is something that we're selling, but we want to introduce you guys to the man who made it, and also kind of a taste for what's going on here. So, Justin, thank you again. I really appreciate it. I hope that we have you get on sometime, maybe to talk about other things in the audio world.
I'd love that. Thanks so much.